We would begin in Mark chapter 6 and verse 14. In Mark chapter 6 and verse 14, now King Herod heard of him, for his name had become well known. And he said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. Of course, referring to Jesus. Others said, he is Elijah. And others said, it is the prophet, or like one of the prophets. But when Herod heard it, he said, this is John, whom I have beheaded. He has risen from the dead. For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. For John had said to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Therefore Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. Then an opportune day came when Herod on his birthday gave a feast for his nobles, the high officials, and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced and pleased Herod and those who sat with him, the king said to the girl, ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you. He also swore to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half of my kingdom. So she went out and said to her mother, what shall I ask? And she said, the head of John the Baptist. Immediately she came in with haste to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And the king was exceedingly sorry. Yet, because of his oath and because of those who sat with him, he did not want to refuse her. And immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought. And he went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl. And the girl gave it to her mother. And when his disciples heard of it, they came and took away his corpse and laid it in a tomb. This is an after fact. This is the story after John the Baptist has been beheaded. This is not when he is beheaded. In this storyline, if you will, of Mark, he is looking back. And it is one of my conclusions why Jesus is condemned by the Pharisees and also John's disciples, that he's not fasting like they are. In fact, what had happened is that when Jesus chooses Matthew throws a big party for Jesus. And here they're feasting rather than mourning the death of John. And this is, again, as King Herod says, he's looking back. It's obvious in the context that he's looking back on the fact that he's already beheaded John the Baptist, and that Jesus is one who's been raised from the dead, and he comes as John being resurrected from the dead. And then the story is told how John ended up dying in this context. I'd like to begin by noting that Herod Antipas, Herod is the title, and then he is Antipas, is the son of Herod the Great. And so technically he is not a king. It's almost as if it's just kind of praising the individual. He is a governor. He is not a king. And we would see that he is given the name tetrarch in Matthew chapter 14, or the title that is, Matthew chapter 14 and verse 1. And so certainly he was a ruler and he had high rank, but it was about the same as a governor. It wasn't king. And of course, this is allowed by Rome. So if anyone was king, it's going to be the emperor of Rome, but they allow the Jews to kind of do their thing, if you will. And so he has this title given to him more out of showing respect, but he is a tetrarch. And so it's a title that's been given to him, and sometimes people just love titles. That'd be a lesson in and of itself. But we will move on. And I want to begin kind of in the middle of the story, if you will. I want to begin with the dangers of making rash vows. Anyone ever made a rash vow? You ever said you're going to do something and then you go, oh no, why did I do that? I used to smoke back in my younger days, and Mother and I, she said, when you quit smoking, I'll lose my weight. And Mom was, how can you say this? At least she's present, right? And you're not going to have to, you can't say anything to me necessarily. She could still put me over her knee, I reckon. But we'll just say that Mom was a very large woman. I said, Mom, it's going to take you some time to lose your weight. When I quit smoking, I'm done. And so actually the day that Dolly and I got married, that morning I got up, I took my cigarettes, I twisted them in two, and I threw them in the trash. I think I bummed 2 or 3 cigarettes after that. But anyways, the point is that I quit. So I go to my mom. Hey, Mom, I quit. And Mom did lose over 100 pounds, but it took her a couple of decades. But nonetheless, we all make vows that we regret. And Herod, Antipas, made a vow he regretted. And so we see that in Mark chapter 6, verses 21 through 23. Then an opportune day came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a feast to his nobles, the high officials or officers, and the chief men of Galilee. So there are some other people in authority, if you will. If it was just some peasant, then maybe he could kind of get away with it. But these are men who have to make judgments on a regular basis and so on. And it's supposed to be your word. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced and pleased Herod and those who sat with him, the king said to the girl, "Ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you." He also swore to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half of my kingdom." Now, I want you to keep in mind that that's not literal. This was what we call a colloquial statement. It's kind of like what you might say, everyone was there. Of course, not everyone was there, but it's that idea that I will give you a very costly, very expensive even, but a gift that is out of the norm. An unusually gracious gift. So don't think when you come across this as a general rule, someone could really say, okay, give me half your kingdom and we'll rule equally 50-50. That was not the case, but he certainly moved to make this rash vow. Now, under the old law, which he should have been familiar with, in Numbers chapter 30 and verse 2, if a man makes a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by some agreement, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. And trust me, for the sake of my mother and her health, I reminded her of this, even though it's Old Testament. Mom, you got your word. I quit smoking years and years, over a decade ago. And it was really just for her own health, but there was some legitimacy to that. If you say you're going to do something, you've got to do it. Of course, we can argue that this is old law, but wait a moment. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 21 through 23, when you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it. You need to do it right then. Don't put it off. Don't procrastinate, for the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and it will be sin to you. I think that's pretty serious. What do you think? But if you abstain from vowing, it shall not be a sin to you. But that which the Lord your God, that which has gone from your lips, you shall keep and perform. For you voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised with your mouth. You did it on your own accord. No one made you. So keep your word. Keep it quickly. Don't delay. Do it. Put your money where your mouth is. Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 2, do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. Think, right? Engage your brain before your mouth, for God is in heaven and you on earth. Therefore, let your words be few. Dropping down to verses 4 and 5 of the same chapter, when you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for He has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Jesus puts it pretty simply in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 37. Let your yes be yes and your no, no. So if we're to learn anything from this story, what we need to learn is to be careful what we say, what we commit ourselves to. And let your yes be yes and your no, no. Anything beyond that is of the devil, Jesus says. So keep your word. In Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 25, it is a snare for a man to devote rashly something as holy and afterward to reconsider his vows. Rethink it. So some of the examples, and this is one that I said I would just refer to just for the sake of time. You remember Jephthah? So he's going to go into battle and he prays to the Lord to win in the battle. And if he does, the first thing that comes out of his house, which he's probably thinking is going to be some pet. A dog, which they didn't really have pets like we have today. It's not a dog anyways. That's why it's always in a derogatory sense. But possibly a lamb. That would definitely be up there. They kept animals in their house that you and I probably would never consider unless you're way out there. But to each his own. He's probably thinking that's what it's going to be, but what stepped out of his house after winning the battle? It's his daughter. And it would seem that he does fulfill that. How about the 40 men who vowed not to eat or drink anything until Paul is dead? I wonder if they kept their vow and died of starvation because they never got their hands on him. And there was a major salvation by the centurion on Paul's behalf. I won't go into it, but there was a lot involved to allow his escape in the middle of the night. And as far as we know, they never caught up with him to fulfill their vow. Second point I'd like to make out of 4 is that Jesus gains respect. This is easily overlooked, but on the heels of John, attributes are directed to Jesus. I want you to give this some thought. In Mark chapter 6, verses 14 and 15, we backed up just a little bit. Now, King Herod heard of him, and he's referring to Jesus, for his name had become well known. And he said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore those powers are at work in him. Others said, it is Elijah, and others said, it is the prophet, or like one of the prophets. Now, it's very plausible that the prophet that he's referring to, and I won't have reference to this, I really meant to put it on there, and then it just didn't even end up in my outline, is in Acts chapter 5. Acts chapter 3. In Acts chapter 3, if you'll notice in verse 22, Acts chapter 3 and verse 22, for Moses truly said to the fathers, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him you shall hear in all things, whatever he says to you. And it continues as far as what was stated. And so that is very, very possible that that's what they're referring to. It is the apostle or like one of the prophets. It is, did I just say apostle? It is the prophet, or like one of the prophets. But that prophet would be this special prophet, spoken of by God to Moses. And that he's referring to Jesus, the Word becoming flesh and dwelling among us. That would definitely be the context. So, we have the mentioning of it. And so, you think about Elijah. Elijah is present with Moses talking to Jesus at his transfiguration. Peter, James, and John are there. They wake up. So, to be spoken of in the likeness of Elijah, that's a huge deal. That he is only one of two that we know of, other than Enoch. So those two individuals that didn't die, unless there's one that I've overlooked. So this is a very, very special man, Elijah. And so for Herod to think, or these other people actually, because Herod concludes it's John, but these other people thinking that that Jesus is Elijah is really a compliment. He came back in that figurative sense that we could read over in Matthew chapter 17, verses 10 through 12. And so, while Jesus is on the cross, many thought that he had called for Elijah. We read that in our thoughts in regard to the Lord's Supper in Matthew's account. So in Mark chapter 6 and verse 16, but when Herod heard, he said, this is John whom I beheaded. See, in the past tense, not that he's doing it in, the context here. He's looking back and he has been raised from the dead. So there is a possible change in the heart of Herod. I want you to take into consideration that Abraham believed in the resurrection. Over in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 through 19, we don't have it in the narrative, but it would seem at some point in time, as Abraham is going, because it took 3 days journey for them to get where they were going to, in order for Abraham to offer Isaac, he concluded, well, if God gave me Isaac when I was past the ability of bearing children and his wife, that would of course include Sarah, then God would be able to raise him from the dead. So this isn't necessarily foreign from the scriptures before the resurrection of Jesus, or Jesus resurrecting people, and also David's son. Remember, he can't come to me, but I can go to him. And so there's a possible change in the conscience of Herod Antipas. In Matthew chapter 14 and verse 5, in Matthew 14 and verse 5, and although he wanted to put him to death, so Herod wanted to put John to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. But then we see here in our context in Mark chapter 6 verse 20, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. So he has a change of heart, it seems. And then we notice in verse 26, whenever the request is made for John's head, the king was exceedingly sorry. So in our last point, which will be here in just a few minutes, I want to make note that even though someone may hate you, you might be able to change their hearts. You might have that opportunity. Don't give up on them. And it would seem that while John is imprisoned, he is able to speak to Herod. And every time he speaks, maybe he softens his heart just a little bit. At first, because of what he's told by John, he wants to kill him, just like his wife, Herodias, wants to. But then there comes a point in time which he protects him. In fact, by throwing him into prison, could have been part of that witness protection that we might have today. Can't give someone a new identity, but maybe back then, but it could certainly put them in custody, which was for their own good. Just as kind of a side point that I want you to take into consideration, we don't have very many young people in the audience, but we do have parents and grandparents, and we need to instill in the hearts of our children how important it is to marry someone who is godly. Not to be equally yoked with those who are contrary. In Mark chapter 6 and verse 17, and for Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. So, just to give you a little backstory, John divorced his wife so that he could marry his own brother's wife. And so Philip and Herodias had to have a divorce. So you have these two divorcees who are marrying, and it was absolutely unlawful. I want you to think about Jezebel killing Naboth for Ahab. She brought this about, right? What about, and I'm not trying to pick on you women, what about Solomon? What turned Solomon? It was his wives. What about Delilah? She finally gets to Samson. And it is to his demise. And then the first woman to ever walk the face of the earth. She's deceived. Adam bears the blame for the sin of the world. He brought sin into the world, Paul argues. Be careful who you marry. I don't think that Herod, when he says you can have up to half of my kingdom, that there is one iota, one blink of a thought that this young woman is going to run to mama. And mama's going to say, I want John's head on a platter. Now that's far, far from our society. We can't really compute that. But I can understand, okay, I want $100,000. I want a new car. I want a big house. I want this and I want that. It's not going to be the death of someone else. And it's not just someone. John has concluded, as we've already noted, that he is a holy and just man. And I believe that the reason he's in prison is for John's trying to protect him. Possibly protect him from his own wife. Can you imagine that it comes to this? I wonder what some of these Hollywood producers would do if they ever read the Bible. They're like, wow, there's a ton of material here. This is rated R. Who does this? Why did the girl listen to her mother? What? I don't want that. She just does it. There are always going to be dangers of speaking the truth. Mark chapter 6, verse 18. For John had said to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. He could have just kept his mouth shut. Have you ever just kept your mouth shut? We all have. At the water fountain, when we hear about the carousing of those what they're going to do this weekend, we might just keep our mouths shut. We don't say, the Lord condemns drunkenness. The Lord condemns revelry. The Lord condemns social drinking. He condemns parties. The Lord condemns homosexuality. The Lord condemns sex before marriage, fornication. The Lord condemns lying. The Lord condemns. Why don't we speak out? Because we know the dangers. But we should. We ought to. We better. Leviticus chapter 18 and verse 16. Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 21. Both speak about divorce. You can't marry your brother's wife. The only time that was actually, I don't know if I'd say encouraged or commanded, but you didn't have to, was that if your brother hadn't bore any children and so on, and there's a process, if they were refused, that you go through. And we would see that in Ruth. But nonetheless, this is an indication that marriage is sacred and a very serious matter to God. So what would happen to the apostles? What did happen to them can happen to us. In Matthew chapter 10, verses 16 and 17, behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. But beware of men, for they will deliver you up to councils and scourging you in their synagogues. It's going to cost you. But it needs to happen. Matthew chapter 10, verses 21 and 22. Now brother will deliver up brother to death. So we're talking about family. We're not just talking about magistrates and kings, those who are in authority that just don't like you and they can snuff you out. Your own blood, Jesus says. And the father his child. And children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. We're appalled when we hear about a child taking their parents to court for whatever reason, right? We've heard that. How about you stand up to have your parents killed, executed, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But he who endures to the end will be saved. See, John was one who cared about people. And his care and his love, his compassion for them, moved him to say what was not politically correct. Moved him to say things that were not going to be well received. Moved him to say things that no one wanted to hear. Moved him to say what needed to be said. For their sakes and to the glory of God. In Luke chapter 9, verses 21 through 24, and he strictly Jesus warned the apostles and commanded them to tell this to no one, saying, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and raised the third day. Now we know that, and it just kind of like you just water off the back of a duck. We know that. But I want you to follow the context. And in verse 23, then he said to them all, if anyone desires to come after me, you want to follow me? And he just got through telling them what? The Son of Man will suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his torture device, his death. Take up your cross daily and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. Now let me reason with you. When you're at the water fountain, when you're talking to someone on the phone, when you're dealing with your family and they bring up some of these activities and thoughts and so on in regard to things that are against the will of God, is your life at risk? Are you really in danger? Do you think that they might come over to your house and blow your head off? To put it bluntly. Do you think that that's really plausible? I mean, I've had some people mad at me. Don't get me wrong. And I can tell you a few stories. But I never really felt like my life was at risk. And even though our life may not be in such jeopardy, which is the extreme, right? To be killed for what you're saying. Is it plausible that you'd be thrown into prison? Is it plausible that you might be harassed, lose your job, this and that, and we can kind of go down the line, right? And at what point do you go, okay, no matter what, at that level, I will say something, but I won't hear. And if I won't hear, I definitely won't hear. In other words, have I kept my mouth shut and not said something to someone when I would just be embarrassed because they're going to turn around and mock me? I'm going to be the laughing stock. I worked at a place years and years ago, and they liked a curse word. If they knew the curse word, I didn't know what the curse word was. Not that I didn't know the curse word, I just didn't know what that curse word was that day. And they'd walk up and say, "Hey, Daryl, word," whatever, you know. And then it escalated from there a little bit by little bit, because you and I are going to have targets on our back. We intimidate. We're the goody two-shoes, and so therefore we condemn them without even saying anything, just because we don't participate in certain activities and we don't talk a certain way and blah, 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 right? My point is that you and I have to be willing to say anything when the most severe repercussions could happen. And if you're really willing to give up your life to teach someone, to tell someone the truth, then certainly you should be able to do it if you're going to be just made fun of. Jesus doesn't say take up your cross and mean that it's a walk in the daisies. It means it could be your life. In Acts chapter 5, verses 40 through 42, and they agreed with him, and when they had called the apostles, this is Peter and John, and brought them, they commanded that they should not speak in the name of Jesus, and let them go. So they departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. And daily in the temple and in every house, they did not cease teaching and preaching Jesus as the Christ. After they're beaten. So we have to be people who stand up, speak out. We must be willing for the cause of Christ to stick our necks out like John did. To the glory of God, to show our reverence to Him, but also to show that we're willing to take up our cross. That we're willing to do anything to even die for the cause of Christ. because that's what he deserves. But it's also for their sake, because Herod was in a wrong relationship. I want you to consider in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 4 through 6, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ, and being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. If we've gotten ourselves right before God, then we're not afraid. We're not ashamed. We're not reluctant that when we have opportunity and we see those things that are standing in opposition to God, we're going to say something. That's what John did. That's what he did. The bravery, the commitment, the dedication, the price he was willing to pay. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 8 through 11. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness, righteousness, and truth, finding out what is acceptable to the Lord. And have no fellowship with unfruitful walks of darkness, but rather expose them. That is our responsibility. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 20, to those who are sinning, rebuke in the presence of all, that the rest also may fear. There are times when that has to be done. And at the water fountain, it may be a backlash. And you may have the whole group against you. But there might be someone. There might be that Herod Antipas, that even though he has joined the crowd, even though he at one time would be willing to kill you because of what you just said that goes against him, just maybe through persistence, he might realize that you are a holy and a just person, that what you speak are the words of God, and maybe he'll change. Herodias' daughter Salome, according to Josephus, danced. I wonder what kind of dance moved this man to make such a rash vow. But he does. And in short, John's head ends up on a platter. Mark chapter 6, verse 21 through 29. Then an opportune day came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a feast for his nobles, the high officers, and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced, and pleased Herod and those who sat with him, the king said to the girl, "Ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you." He also swore to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half of my kingdom." So she went out and said to her mother, "What shall I ask?" Pretty white horse, riches, honor. She doesn't say those things. That's what would be going through my mind. And she said, the head of John the Baptist. You're going to make enemies. It's just the way it is. If you stand for anything worth standing for, you will have opposition. Period. Immediately she came in with haste to the king and asked, saying, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And the king was exceedingly sorry. Yet, because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he was between a hard place and a rock. He couldn't back out. He did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought. Can you imagine? And he went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl. This is no fairy tale, folks. A great man, the forerunner of Jesus Christ, snuffed out because he said, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." That's all it took. That's all it took. And the girl gave it to her mother. And then, maybe like King Saul, John's followers come and take the corpse. Take this headless body and bury it. I wonder what they did with John's head. They put it on a pole. They put it in formaldehyde in a big jar. Of course not, but was he on display? But where's John today? You and I, we may not lose our heads. You and I one day will take our last breath. The question is, have we stood for Christ or have we been cowards? Have we confessed Him or have we kept our mouths shut and therefore we have denied Him? It's easy to proclaim Jesus Christ in a room like this, isn't it? But out there's the real world. What are we going to do when it really, really counts? And that's the ending of John the Baptist. It's a glorious ending, isn't it? A man willing to die. Not even for Christ, like you and I have something to die for in that same sense. Someone who loved the law of God so radically, so willing to tell anyone and everyone, especially those who are violating it, what they need to do. It divides. It is a sword that Christ has brought. It is the Word of God. It's a double-edged sword. And it'll pierce everything. May it pierce our hearts to show us, not you, me, and not me to you, but show ourselves who we really are. Are we truly devoted and willing to risk it all because He's already died for us? Or will we keep our mouths shut? You and I answer that question every time we're given opportunity. Every day of our lives. To either proclaim or to tear down everything that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. What's really truth. What's really right. May we be